The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody and welcome to unit number 5 in the Lunch and Learn series, which is about understanding people and their personalities. This is one of my most enjoyable units. It's a lot of fun, but it also makes a lot of sense as well. So I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So if you could just type in the question box clear, that lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear to you. So welcome to you wherever you're tuning in, and it's great to have you on board for this the fifth of the 6 series modules. So I hope you've had a chance to complete uh, your personality profile, because pretty much this hour is taken up debriefing you on that profile. Now, if you haven't done it yet, don't despair, because it just means you'll get a bit of a heads up, and you can complete this as soon as the broadcast is complete. So either way, you will benefit. But the ideal circumstance, of course, is to have your profile done, so that we can run through what the profile means for you in terms of your capacity to lead other people. All right, so let's move on. Now, just to do a quick recap, if I may, you'll be aware now, of course, that we are now in module number 5, and we looked at giving positive and negative feedback and doing that on a regular basis, and you were set some homework around that, and that was about giving 3 bits of feedback every day. I'm hoping that you're still doing that. You were then we then subjected you to the influencing capabilities profile, and basically this was about how you can get the best from the people that you lead by using influence rather than hierarchical position. And then in module 3, we looked at the optimizing team performance, and essentially my message there was very much around the ability to have regular check-ins, if you like, or conversations with each of your team members, and I'm hoping that you continue to do that, and I'm hoping that's bearing fruit for you, and I'm sure that you will find that it does help connect. And remember, what we're really about there is a small increase, not necessarily an unrealistic increase in performance. And if we can do that with each individual, it's likely that we're going to get a good result at the end. Then we looked last time, 2 weeks ago in fact, at getting the very best from people. And what we were really looking there is a couple of really useful frameworks and models and practical approaches. But essentially, my message there was that we should be using autonomy, mastery, and purpose when we try and get the best out of people. And what that basically means is that we need to give people the freedom to make their own decisions and make their own choices. We need to give them the opportunity to be able to develop, and we also need to explain the purpose of what they're doing, so that they have a line of sight between the work that they're doing and the end result. So that's where we've got to in the program. So we're well and truly through the program, and today, of course, we're going to look at understanding people and their personalities. And in 2 weeks' time, our final unit is on facilitating effective meetings. So, like usual, if you've got any questions, comments, observations, whatever you might like to call it, go to the question box there and type it in during the presentation, and I will deal with it. And remember, when you type something in there, I'm the only one that can see it, and I will simply respond to it on behalf of everybody that's in this Lunch and Learn webinar. All right, so that's where we've got to. So let's move on to today's program. You were asked, of course, to do some homework, and that was to use those concepts of autonomy and mastery and purpose in your decision making and conversation. So stick to it no matter what. So I'm always interested in feedback. I'm always interested in how that's worked for you, or perhaps even not worked for you. So send me an email offline if you like, and let me every single one of us in this broadcast has worked with, or maybe working with, somebody that you just don't get. And, this is what we call a personality clash. And, you just don't see eye to eye. And there's a range of reasons for that. It could well be that perhaps you've got different personalities, different different predispositions to the way you look at things. And that's what we're going to cover today, give you an exercise to help you with that. So enjoy. As always, you'll get a copy of the slides, and you will also get a copy of the recording as well, so you can go back and review. So just relax. There's no need to take notes. It's just a matter of being absorbed in the information that I'm giving you, and feel free, as I say, to participate wherever you feel you want to participate. So what are we covering in this short session? Well, I'm going to talk about personality generally and what it means and what some of the research says about personality. I'm going to talk about understanding personality traits, and if you've completed your your personality profile, it'll make sense to you to see where you fit in with those 4 personality types that I'm sure you saw on the on the on the profile that you did. We'll talk about some application tools. In other words, how do you deal with these 4 personality groups that I'm going to share with you? And finally, I'm going to talk about the platinum rule, which is distinct from the golden rule. Of course, the golden rule is treat people how they, sorry, start again, treat people how you want to be treated. And that's pretty much conventional thinking and has been for over 2,000 years. But I think perhaps a better way to go is to use what we call the platinum rule, which is treat people how they want to be treated, and you'll tend to get a better result if you do that. And of course, what that means is you need to understand their personality traits and be able to deal with them accordingly. Now, when I say that, I'm not suggesting that you and I become, inauthentic. It really is, we're still ourselves, we're just accentuating a part of our personality, which is likely to get a better result because that part of our personality is more compatible with the persons that we're dealing with, rather than us sticking to our own personality type. That's essentially what I'm getting at. So you can have some fun with this afternoon, looking around the office or production area or wherever you are, and sort of start to be thinking about who fits into what category, if you like. All right, now, um, there are lots and lots of personality profiles out there, as we know. And many of those have got very strange names. So you've got Myers-Briggs, you've got DISC, you've got a range of different profiles. You've got an urban brain and dominance theory, and there's a whole bunch, and I'm sure many of you have done several of these profiles. The one that I've shared with you, I've based it on 4 animal types because I did this for a very clear reason. I wanted people to have something that's easy to remember, but yet still fairly accurate. So we've got owls and lambs and bulls and peacocks. So I'm going to be referring to owls, lambs, bulls, and peacocks throughout this presentation, so that it's just easy when you think of a bull, for example, what their traits are, or if you think of a lamb, what their traits are. It's fairly simple to be able to make some generalizations about the characteristics of those animals. So that's why I'm using 4 different animals in this presentation. Okay, now I just want to say something about personality before we go any further. Personality comes from the Greek word persona, which means mask. Now basically, what a personality is like a mask. It's not something we necessarily hide behind, but it's something we wear, and we wear it, and it's our way of being able to deal with the world. So, um, for some people, their mask might be to be very structured and very organized. For other people, their mask might be to be very gregarious and outgoing. For these traits. And of course you can't. That's true. And if you look at your scores on your profile, you'll notice that it's highly unlikely that you had 40 points in one column. It's probably likely that you had a distribution of responses across the four categories, which basically does validate the concept that we are all four personalities. However, it's likely that the dominant score, that is the higher score, is your predisposition. And what that means is that you fall into acting that way most of the time. Of course, the higher your scores in one column, for example, if you've got 20 plus points in one column, then that's obviously 50% of your score. Then it's highly likely that when you looked at the descriptors on the profile that you printed out, you would have noted that a lot of those traits were very similar to the traits that you display day to day, moment by moment, situation by situation. So that's easily explained, of course, because you've got a predisposition towards those traits in that personality grouping. Now, coming back to the question of where this mask came from, there has been a debate about the fact that, well, some theorists have said that certainly this was the conventional thinking in the mid 20th century. The conventional thinking was that you are a product of your environment. So, in other words, you are molded and shaped by your environmental influences, so that, you know, if you wanted to understand how somebody operated, you just have to look at their past experience, the type of jobs they had, the type of relationships they had, the hardships they've had, the experiences that they have had. Um, that theory still holds some relevance, but approximately 20 years ago, the pendulum swung in the other direction and said that personality very much is a genetic predisposition. Not hereditary, but genetic. In other words, you didn't necessarily inherit your personality from your mother and father, but you probably had some very firm traits well entrenched as a young child coming from a genetic predisposition. So those of you who've got young children would be aware that those children very much have got a clear personality very early on in their life. And so it does make you think that perhaps that theory's got some relevance, that perhaps, you know, you are born with a personality, so to speak. Um, so now the latest research, particularly in the area of neuroplasticity, and basically neuroplasticity is saying that there's been evidence that the brain changes shape throughout your life, or, you know, there are, you know, if you took brain scans, for example, of somebody that's meditated, starts meditating, say for 6 weeks, you took a brain scan of that person before they started meditating, and you took a brain scan 6 weeks after, you would find that well, the brain will have changed because of the environmental influence of the meditation. So there is a view now that your personality can change throughout your life, and that you can do something to shape and mold it in certain ways, so that perhaps you can become more outgoing, or perhaps you might become quieter and more reflective, and so forth. So, look, there is interesting theories out there, and you can make up your own mind. But the bottom line is that we do have this mask, and we do wear it, and we do protect ourselves against the elements of the world by looking through this mask. We view things in a certain way, lenses, if you like. So, let's have a look at the model. And what I'll do is I'll share the model with you, and then we'll look at the characteristics of each of the four personalities, and I'll talk about some famous characters that fit the mold. So you'll notice that it's a typical 2x2 matrix, and we've got, as you can see on your screen there, owls and bulls in the top two, and we've got lambs and peacocks in the bottom two. So let's have a look at some broad categories around that might be helpful. So the first one that's of interest is the concept of introversion and extroversion. Now, we hear these words a lot, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what introversion and extroversion actually means. So let's just debunk some of the myths around that for a start. I mean, one of the obvious myths is that people are, to be a leader, you need to be extrovert. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, surveys have suggested that 4 out of 10 CEOs in this country, that is Australia, are actually introvert. So it's not necessarily the case. In fact, just because you're an extrovert doesn't make you a good leader. Equally, just because you're an introvert doesn't make you a poor leader. And I've worked for some managers who are introverts who are outstanding leaders. And equally, I've worked for extroverts that are very poor leaders. So what does it actually mean? Well, if you really boil it all down, introversion and extroversion is really how you recharge your batteries. And we all need to do that, of course. Life is full of challenges and energy draining activity. So introverts have a tendency to recharge their batteries by going within. So in other words, they, being on their own, thinking, reflecting, perhaps involved in an activity which is a very personal activity. Whereas extroverts will have a tendency to do the opposite, and that is when they want to recharge their batteries, they'll often get involved with other people, perhaps just to have a bit of a chit chat, and basically that's how they like to operate. Now, if you look at your scoring sheet, if you've got it in front of you, if you look at your OWL and your LAM score and you add those two together, and if you add up your bull and your peacock score, it will give you a score for introversion and extroversion from your profile. In other words, if your OWL and LAM score is significantly higher, collaboratively higher than your bull and your peacock score, then it probably suggests you have a predisposition to introversion, which of course won't surprise you. You would know that. But it's just interesting to see what the balance is. Equally, if you have a significantly higher score collectively when you add your bull and your peacock score up compared with your OWL and LAM score, it's likely that you're more prone to being an extrovert rather than an introvert. So you can see first up whether you're more prone to introversion and extroversion. Now, people often say to me, well, when I was younger, I was more introvert and now I'm a little bit more extrovert, or when I was younger, I was a bit of the life of the party and now I've got very quiet. Some people will say, at home I'm introvert, at work I'm extrovert, or vice versa. I think what that does explain is the fact that we have learned behaviour. So what happens as an adult is you learn to adapt and modify to the circumstances that you're facing. So, for example, if you're introvert, you've learned to perhaps speak up in meetings because otherwise you're just seen as a wallflower. And of course, if you're an extrovert, you've learned to perhaps keep quiet more so in meetings because you might be annoying people by dominating meetings. So I don't think it's necessarily that you've changed, it's just that you have learned to adapt to circumstances. So you can, introversion and extroversion, you might want to look at that. Now, obviously, if your scores are fairly even, it probably suggests it depends on what it is or who it's with will determine whether or not you're introvert or extrovert. So it just simply means that you're probably a little bit more flexible and it depends on the circumstances or the people that you're with. Now, the other dimension that's interesting is the dimension around the one on the right-hand side, which is waiting for this to come up. There we go. So you've got task focus and relationship focus. So that's the other dimension that's interesting. So people who are task focused are people who believe that getting things done, getting stuff done is the critically important element. So bulls and owls are very much task focused in terms of their personality. People focused is more around, I need to feel comfortable and have good working relationships with the people that I'm working with first and foremost before we deal with a task. So lambs and peacocks fall into that category. Now, obviously, in the workplace, it's both, isn't it? We need to be task focused because that's what we get paid to do. But we also have to deal with and through other people in order to get the task done. So both of those things are critically important. But which comes first for you? If you add up your owl and your bull score on your profile, and you add up your lamb and your peacock score on your profile, it will tell you whether you're predisposed more to being task focused or people focused. Now, again, the misunderstanding is that if people are task focused, that means they probably can't deal very well with people. That's not true at all. And likewise, if you're very people focused, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't get anything done. So we actually need both of those, but you may find that you've got a predisposition to one or the other. Now, of course, if your scores are fairly even, then it would suggest that it depends on what you're doing or who you're working with as to whether you're more task or people focused. That's all that simply means. So there's two interesting things about your profile straight off the bat. And of course, what that does is it creates 4 personality types, which are the ones that I just spoke about previously. And you can see now on your screen that owls are introvert and task focused, bulls are extrovert and task focused, lambs are introvert and people focused, and peacocks are extrovert and people focused. So that gives you an interesting starting point in your profile. Now, of course, when you're dealing with other people, it might well explain their behaviours or lack of behaviours when you look at them and try and understand whether they're introvert or extrovert or task or people focused. So let's go a little bit deeper into this now and start looking at the personality types. The first one I want to talk about is the peacock, because I'm just going in the order of the profile here, and this of course occurs in the first column. So it doesn't matter what the order is, it's just I'm going with that for convenience sake. But let's have a look at the peacock's primary motivation. The peacock's primary motivation is being popular. Now these are all ideals because it's impossible to be popular right across the board. It's impossible to be any of these primary motivations. However, the peacock strives to be recognised and sought after and thought well of, and that happens to be their primary motivation. And of course, it doesn't always occur, of course, but that doesn't stop the peacock personality from attempting to do that. So the characteristics of the peacock is that they are very much extrovert. They're talkers, so they like to. In fact, often the peacock will say to you, "I'm just thinking out aloud," and that's how they think. They think by talking, whereas an introvert would find that difficult to understand. They'd often actually think, "Well, I'll do the thinking first, and then once I've thought it through, I'll offer my opinion in a meeting." They're generally optimists. In other words, they often see a half full glass as half full rather than half empty. So there's a tendency for them to see the silver lining rather than the cloud. Doesn't mean that they aren't prone to depression at times. It just simply means that overall the general predisposition is towards optimism. So their personality type is usually an engaging or appealing personality. They're usually reasonably creative. There is a tendency for them to have a fairly high energy level, to be quite engaged and enthusiastic, and people will often refer to them as quite inspiring. So that gives you their strengths and the areas that, and of course, the interesting thing about the peacocks is that of all four personality types, they're the ones that can get away with the most in the workplace, because often people just dismiss their behaviour by saying things like, oh, that's just Fred, or that's just Mary, that's just the way they are, whereas the other personalities don't often get away with that. So that's their strengths, and some famous people that fit that bill. I'm thinking, as you can see on your page there's a picture of Paris Hilton on the bottom right-hand corner. And Paris Hilton went to jail a couple of years ago for tax evasion. And I don't think she spent a long time in jail, but the thing is that she made it a publicity stunt. So she actually decided to make some publicity from the whole notion of going to jail. Now, most people would just quietly do their time and come out and hopefully not rock the boat or make too much of a noise about it. But the peacocks are very much interested in, they're certainly not worried about, revealing, what they do and so forth. And I'm sure if you're not a peacock, you've had people in your workplace that have revealed information about themselves, and you've thought to yourself, I'd never say that in a million years. But they feel quite comfortable with that. Now, the great Scottish comedian Billy Connolly, who of course is hilarious, is definitely a peacock in terms of his personality. And I'd urge you to go onto YouTube and have a look at some of those videos. Apart from having a good laugh, you'll see a highly unstructured comedian. You'll see someone that goes off on a tangent, they'll go on another tangent, and they'll just keep going off on these tangents. And that's how they operate in lots of ways. And in fact, I remember reading a biography of Billy Connolly, and Billy Connolly does not plan meticulously what he's going to say during one of his stand-up comedy routines. He just goes with the flow. And for many people, that would be a terrifying prospect. But for the peacock, they, of all the four personalities, perhaps feel the most comfortable, at least, winging it. So there's two people that probably fit the bill quite well, I would suggest. So their motivation or their motto in life is this: any publicity is good publicity. So the classic Hollywood movie star, and not all Hollywood actors, I might say, fit this mold, but the classic Hollywood movie star, the person that is always been spoken of in the gossip columns, is probably likely to have a predisposition towards the peacock personality. In fact, they would probably even be disappointed if people didn't say anything about them in the columns, and whether the information is accurate or inaccurate is not as important as the fact that something is being said. So there's the peacock personality. Moving on to the bull personality now. Now, the bull personality has a different, remember, they're still extrovert, like the peacock, but there is a difference. And let me just give you a couple of indicators around how the bull likes to operate. Their primary motivation is being powerful. Now, again, it's impossible for anyone to be powerful all the time. It depends on the circumstances, how one feels, what the situation is, who's in the room, all the rest of it. But the big fear that the bull has is being taken advantage of. They're fearful of about that. So what they do is they'll often gravitate to leadership roles, because obviously if you're in a leadership role, it's less likelihood that you'll be taken advantage of. Not always, of course, because that's an ideal that can't always be met. So that's their primary motivation. Their characteristics are, as in the case of the peacock, is that they're extrovert, they're doers, And normally the bull will have about 10 projects and they're juggling all these projects at once. And the whole purpose of that is they've probably bitten off too much, but they've always got things on the go. And like the peacock, they're also half full people. In other words, they're optimists generally. So the glass is half full rather than half empty. But the big difference, of course, is that they are biting off more than they can chew in many, many cases. So their great strengths are that they are born leader. Now, by a born leader, I don't necessarily mean they're a gifted leader. What I really mean by that is that of the four personalities, the bull is the most likely to feel comfortable in a leadership role. All right, so where the other three personalities would have a fair degree of anxiety about being put into a leadership role, am I going to cope? Is this really for me? All of those doubting questions, the leader just sees it as their responsibility to lead. So they're very goal oriented. In fact, they don't like details and they really just want to know what the big picture is. And you'll often hear bulls making statements like, the bottom line is, all right, or what's the end game? They'll make these sort of statements and they're very quick to action. So they will certainly move quickly into action. Some people might say that they're impatient at times, but they want to get results and they want to get results quickly because that gives them a sense of autonomy and control over their lives. So two famous personalities that come to mind, and I think it's important for me to be not just politically correct here, but also to make the points that there is no gender bias in any of this. So Madonna, the musician who's still pumping out albums, I believe she's got another one coming out this year when she could really just be sitting back, putting her feet up and relaxing. She's still hard at it. And if you look at her career, what she's done, of course, is that she's managed her career almost entirely on her own. So she hasn't relied on a minder or whatever. I'm sure she's got plenty of people supporting her. But at the end of the day, her main focus has been her managing her own career. And she can be very blunt and to the point, and we know that. We've seen interviews and we've heard her speak because she's been around for many, many years. And of course, Hillary Clinton, who was the presidential candidate in 2016 against the current president, Donald Trump, would fit the mold of the bull. So, very self-opinionated, very direct, biting off more than they can chew, lots of energy, lots of get up and go, and quite forthright. So you can see examples of the bull traits in both Madonna and Hillary Clinton. So their motto in life is that I'm in control and I'm willing to lead. So the bull is very much willing to lead, and that's a really important trait for them, that if there's a vacuum of leadership there, then they will jump in and lead. So the owl, moving on to the owl personality is their primary motivation is being perfect. So what I mean by that, of course, nobody can be perfect. It's an ideal, like popular and power, but the owl is always striving to come up with the perfect answer or the perfect result or construct the perfect product or give the perfect service. So they're perfectionists. That would probably be an adjective that would a perfectionist is somebody that is always striving to get things done, and that's probably a word that would best describe the owl. So their characteristics, now remember, the owl is more introvert, whereas I've just gone through two personalities that are more extrovert. They're more introvert. So they are introverts, meaning that they go within. They're thinkers. They like to think things through. They'll often spend long times and very deep thought about the motivations of other people and how to deal with a situation, they will often put a lot of thought into that, and some might even criticize them for thinking too much. And unlike the peacock and the bull, the owl is a pessimist. In other words, the glass is half empty, not half full. So they'll see the cloud, not the silver lining. Now, that doesn't mean they walk around being negative all day, but they're very good at assessing risk. So they will be very good at being able to look at a proposal or a strategy or an idea, and they will offer a suggestion about risk. Now, that can be perceived to be negative, but in actual fact, what's happened is the owl has got a lot to offer in that sense, because they've actually thought through carefully the proposal, idea, or project. So it's not like they're just shooting off and being negative. They've actually thought it through. That's the difference. So they can be misunderstood like the other personalities. They love their schedules. In fact, they're quite habitual the way they do things. They'll have the same breakfast cereal. They'll do things the same way. They enjoy setting targets and schedules. They have very high standards. Now, this is another misunderstanding of the owls. They have very high standards of everybody else, but don't forget they've also got very high standards of themselves. So they're hard on themselves. In fact, I would suggest they're too hard on themselves at times, and they set themselves impossible challenges, and sometimes they'll fall flat, which can affect their self-esteem. Now, if we look at some personalities around the world that fit this category that are well known, of course, Leonardo da Vinci is no longer with us, but the Renaissance man, that brilliant artist, amongst other things, was a perfectionist. And what he did, and you can see the sketches of the human body there on the right-hand side. You may have seen those when you were studying at school. What he actually did to depict the muscular structure of the human body, in other words, to do those sketches that you're seeing on the bottom right-hand corner, is he actually went into a graveyard. He actually dug up a body and dissected the body, because he wanted to study the muscular system to a point where he got it absolutely right. Now, that's pretty fanatical, but that's what perfectionists do. And that's how he went about his work. Now, Roger Federer, on the other hand, the great tennis player who's incredibly still going at, 37, 38, world number one, the oldest ever, he is a complete perfectionist when it comes to practice. And there's probably nobody in the tennis world that practices to the level that he does, because he wants to play the perfect game. So Federer is probably a very good example of somebody like that. So their motto in life is that, how can I paint this perfect picture? That's really what they're concerned about. So what will happen, of course, is that the owls will be criticised often because they'll take too long to get something done. And when challenged about that, they'll often say, it's because I'm trying to get it right. All right, so sometimes they will miss deadlines because they're trying to get the perfect answer. All right, moving right along. Now, the final of the four personalities is the lamb. Now, let's have a look at the lamb, and let's look at the traits of the lamb. Their primary motivation is being peaceful. Now, again, like the other three traits, this is an ideal. It's impossible to be peaceful all the time. If there were two people on a desert island, for example, there will at some point be some conflict. So again, it's an ideal, but this is what the lamb tries to aspire to. So what that means is that they have the following characteristics. The lamb is, like the owl, an introvert. They tend to be watchers. So what will happen is, in a meeting, they'll watch and listen to all the contributions made by the team members, and then once they feel it's okay, they'll contribute their point of view. So again, like the owls, the glass is half full, so they're pessimists generally speaking. But again, it's not suggesting for a minute that they're being negative for negative's sake, but there is a predisposition towards that. So it pretty much means that they'll avoid conflict and steer away from that. Now, their strengths are that they're competent and steady. So you give a lamb a job and you'll generally find that they'll get it done reasonably competently. They will work at a steady rate and get it done. Sometimes they can be criticised for not working fast enough, and that criticism would normally come from a bull boss, but they're peaceful and agreeable, and they're really good at mediating problems. So if there's two perspectives in the workplace, they will often be able to steer or navigate a middle path. In other words, they'll see both sides of the story and be able to turn that into some sort of, hopefully some sort of constructive way forward if they're forced to do that. So what personalities worldwide might fit that bill? Well, two famous actors that I can think of, and as I said at the outset, not all actors are peacocks. The movie stars probably are, but but not all actors are. For example, Keanu Reeves, that brilliant actor from The Matrix and a number of other movies. Excuse me for a moment. He shuns publicity. In fact, he just, will avoid it at all costs, and he hates having his picture taken on the streets of New York. He lives in the same house that he's had forever, even though he's worth millions or perhaps even hundreds of millions. He dresses down. He doesn't like being the centre of attention. Now, Kirsten Stewart is the female equivalent of that. And you don't see her in the gossip columns too often. She enjoys her privacy, and she'll have a tendency to be very guarded about her private life. So there's two actors that really don't like the limelight of Hollywood, but nevertheless are part of Hollywood. So you can see that these personalities can pop up anywhere. And in terms of their primary motivation, they would suggest that peace is the overriding objective. So not rocking the boat, making sure there's harmony, making sure morale is high, all of those things become critically important to the lamb. And in fact, if they're working in a confrontational environment, that will be enormously stressful for a lamb because, of course, their motivation is about being peaceful. So there you go. There are the four personality types. So if you've got any questions, comments, observations, you know what to do. Just go to the question box and type in your question, and I'm more than happy to try and respond to it if I can. So while you might be thinking of that, now we need to move on to look at some of the ways of dealing with these personality types. And I suppose what I'm getting at here is the really important point here is that what you should be trying to do is to try to identify the people that are working in your area in terms of their personality type. If you find that difficult, it probably can be explained by a couple of things. One is that you haven't been there very long, or two, it could be that they have a very equal scores across all four of those profile personalities, in which case you don't see some dominant traits to the extent that you might with others that have got very high scores in one of those four columns. So don't despair, but it would be fairly obvious, I would have thought, even by now, that you would have been able to identify some peacocks and some owls and some lambs and some bulls in the people you interact with daily. So if you're dealing with a peacock, I think the important first point I'd say is recognise that they're challenged by following through. So they'll make promises And often what will happen is that they'll drop the ball on those promises, not because they don't have an integrity, it's just that they've gone off on another tangent somewhere. They're not the most structured of the personality types, and this can be very annoying to an owl or a bull. So you need to gently remind them of the promises that they've made in order to get them to follow through. So sending them an email, just gently reminding them in the corridor that the project's due in at 3 o'clock this afternoon and so forth is probably a very good thing. And the peacock actually appreciates that if it's done the right way, because the peacock needs somebody to keep them on track. Secondly, realise that sometimes they talk without thinking. So what that means is that the peacock is prone to have foot-in-mouth disease, and they can often say things that perhaps haven't been thought through. So they might come up with a wild idea, or they might say something that's a little bit tactless in the workplace, and it doesn't mean that they are trying to be annoying or confrontational. It simply means that they probably haven't really thought too much about it. So just relax with that and just realize that that's the way they like to do things. They like to think aloud. So they're not, just don't interpret that as meaning that they're obviously nasty people, or even they should have thought before they open their mouth, because that's not how they operate. Realise that they thrive on variety and flexibility, so they like to do lots of different things, and doing routine work is not their forte, and they'll find that very difficult to do. Don't expect them to remember appointments or necessarily be on time. Again, they need to be organised and scheduled, and if someone else can do that, all the better. But don't get upset with them about those things. They're not actually going out of their way to be disruptive. They actually do want to be on time. They do want to remember appointments. It's just that they've got a lot of things going on in their head, and sometimes they just don't record it or write it down. They're not noted for recording and writing down information in their calendar, if they even have a calendar. Be prepared to hear their stories, right? They'll often have an amusing joke or a great story, and apart from the fact that it is amusing or interesting, it's a good idea to hear it out. And often when you do that, you'll find that they can become very compliant because you've fed them what they want, and they'll be inclined to do what you want as their leader. All right, the bull. Now, let's talk about the bull. The bull, if you're dealing with a bull in the workplace, recognize that they're comfortable leading. Now, what that basically means is this, that if they see a vacuum of leadership, in other words, if they don't feel that you are stepping up, that means that they see it is their responsibility to step into the arena. Now, that can be misinterpreted as some sort of a power game where they're trying to take over. All they're simply rationalizing in their head is there is a vacuum of leadership here, and I'm going to take the responsibility and fill it. You see how misunderstood that can be? It's actually quite an honourable intent, but it's often not played out that way, or at least perceived that way. Insist on two-way communication. Now, what I mean by that is be firm with bulls. A lot of people don't realise this, that the bulls want you to be firm. They want you to be clear. They want you to be concise. So be firm, clear, and concise, and remind them that you have a complete right to have your say as well. And if you are firm with the bull, what happens is that they psychologically see a mirror image of themselves, and they think, wow, that person's just like me. Aren't they wonderful? So instead of backing off, you need to just be firm and assertive wherever possible. And just remember that they're not out to try and hurt anybody. They're no more hurtful as a personality than anybody else. But bulls are not interested in small talk. They're not really interested in chit-chat. They'll often get straight to the point and sometimes be criticised for not, setting a rapport and that sort of thing. Remember, they're task focused. So they don't actually mean to go out and hurt you, but sometimes that, in fact, is what happens. So be firm and to the point, and I mentioned this earlier, it's very important for that to happen. And realise that they're not displayed for outward displays of compassion, because, of course, that could be perceived as a sign of weakness. So they don't wear their heart on their sleeve. It does not mean they don't have feelings, despite what you might think, but it's just that they don't go around parading it, such as the peacock may do. So they keep that to themselves. All right, what about the owls? Let's have a look at the owls. The owls' personality is they know that they can get hurt very easily, because they've always got high standards of themselves. And of the four personalities, the owls are the most, should I say, highly strung. They're often interpreting or thinking through, why did someone say what they say? Why did they mean this? Why do they mean that? So they can get hurt very easily. So choose your words carefully, particularly if you're talking about their workmanship. If you criticise the work that they do, be very careful how you do that, because remember, being perfectionists, it's likely that they'll take that to heart. Doesn't mean you shouldn't pull people up for substandard work. Realise that they're programmed with a mindset that likes to assess risk, and as I said earlier, they will tend to see the pitfalls in an argument much quicker than the other four personalities. Why? Because they think it through. So they're not out to be negative, they just have actually got something very valid to say, which may well mitigate a real risk in the workplace. Be prepared to answer their questions. Being flippant and short and sharp is not the go here. If the owl asks you a question, they'll expect a detailed answer. And if they don't get it, their sense of respect for you will go down. So yes, they will ask a lot of annoying questions, but they're asking them because they want to know the right answer. Why do they want to know the right answer? Because they want to do the perfect job. And information helps people to shape their responses to a challenge. Keep a reasonable schedule. They're not happy if you chop and change and all over the place, but they want to know that there's a schedule involved and that you'll stick to that, because, of course, routine is critically important to the owl, more so than any of the other three personalities. Realise that your arguments and opinions have got to be backed up with some substance. There's no point in you just saying, oh, well, that's what I think. You can certainly say that's what I think, and it's based on the following information. So you need to back up your arguments with substance. Otherwise, the owl will see you as being very flippant and lightweight. And finally, the lamb. The lamb personality, realise that they need to be clear about the direction you're heading. So setting targets, setting goals, setting deadlines is critically important for the lamb. Help them to agree on the targets and help them set those targets. Don't always expect outward signs of enthusiasm. They might be quite excited internally, but they're not going to show it on their face necessarily. It doesn't mean that they're not motivated. And realise, interesting enough, when they put off tasks, in other words, they put things in the too hard basket, just recognise that that's their quiet form of control. Whereas the bull will probably say, I don't want to do that, I'm not doing that. Whereas the lamb won't say that, because that may potentially bring around conflict. So what they simply do is they quietly procrastinate to a point where, you've really got to eyeball them and ask them for it. Now, if that's the case and they're a lamb, it's because they think that what you're asking them is unreasonable or is certainly not a high priority on their list. Look for mutual commitments. So what you're looking for is agreements from them. Once you get an agreement from a lamb, they're likely to follow through, because they won't want to rock the boat. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully now I want you to think carefully about this golden rule. Now, the golden rule, of course, as I said at the outset of this broadcast, is treat people how you want to be treated. Now, what I'm challenging you with is a new rule, which is called a platinum rule. And the platinum rule states that you should treat people how they want to be treated. So what that basically means is that you try and identify those personality types in your workplace and try to, as much as possible, feed into the conversations that you have with those personality types the traits that will appeal to them. Now, I want you to have some fun with this, as I said at the outset. And the good news is after this, you can go out and practice this and have a crack at it and see what sort of results you get. You'll be quite surprised at what a difference it can make in terms of changing the personality dynamic with people that you may have been in conflict with. And I've got some homework for you as we finish up today, and that is I want you to try to modify your approach and lead people with an emphasis on personality type. So I actually want you to go out over the next fortnight and start treating people how they want to be treated and see what happens. You may be very surprised. And by all means, you can send me an email or maybe during the next broadcast you can come with your observations, which would always be interesting. So, guys, that's it. We're done for today, and I've looked forward to sharing this unit with you. And you can see now on the screen that we've got one to go, which is the facilitating effective meetings in a fortnight. So, thank you again. I hope you found that useful, and I hope that you can go away and practice some of these particular traits in your workplace so that you can build better working relationships with the people you lead. So thank you very much, and I wish you all the very best for the future, and have a great weekend. Goodbye.